a podcast guest because his internet is down. I read Mike Adams, the national news guy, said his internet was screwy, and some of our TNT guests are having bad internet. What is Cyber Polygon coming soon? Anyways, with over a decade of experience in capital markets and portfolio management, Darin Tuttle left Goldman Sachs to manage multi-million-dollar portfolios in his early 20s as a millennial money manager. Darin has been featured in Forbes, Yahoo, Finance, Business Digest magazine, StreetInsider.com for his expert insights. Principled and passionate, Darin has an uncompromising dedication to help others by managing their investments. His website is Tuttle Ventures, that's Tuttle Ventures.com, as well as his Substack would be newsletter.tuttleventures.com, and you can find him on Twitter at Darin_T80, as in the number. Welcome to TNT Radio, Darin.
Hrvoje, hey, thanks for having me on. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time. And, maybe real quick, just to start, I had a guest on from India, an investor and economy finance guy. And his story was, coming from nothing and then emigrating to the US and making it. And there was a recent tweet of yours that went pretty viral. And it's sort of your, coming of age story where you moved to California with your family. You were sharing a car. You were riding a bike for almost a year. Just, real quick, if you want to tell us a bit about yourself and the work you do at Tuttle.
Yeah, no, certainly. It's Twitter has been a great place for me to be able to, share ideas, to get informed, and to find out what's really going on in the world. Most of the time, people don't really share, personal stories or, actually share different financial plans or successes. And so, I did have a tweet that got over 5 million views. It talked about moving to California. Like I said, I'm a California native, born and raised in Sacramento. And, we had always planned to move back to California, but we wanted to make it work financially and stick within a budget. And so we shared a car for a year, and I rode my bike to work, much to the chagrin of my boss, who, wanted to keep up appearances and things like that, and didn't really want me making that sacrifice for my family. But we were able to do that and put together some things. One day my bike was stolen, and, putting things together, we checked our finances and made sure that we had saved enough to be able to put a new down payment on a car. And so that was 5 years ago now. And, since that time, the principles of financial independence, planning, and goals-based investing has been the hallmark of Tuttle Ventures today.
All right. Very, very cool. I love those kinds of stories. And, some things you had wanted to touch on included, well, basically what I do every day, which is analyzing the world of money and power. I'd also want to get your thoughts as to the state of the economy and many, many other things. But, where would you like to start?
I think I'd like to start with just why, I think your show is important and the type of listener that I can relate to, as being a fan of the show and now also a participant on the show, right? I think it goes back to Paul Revere. If you remember Paul Revere back in 1775, going around warning the neighbors the midnight before the British troops arrived to kind of kick off the Revolutionary War in America. He was a sounding board, a watchman, so to speak, of what was to come in the future. And, I think that I can relate, and I often find myself being in that Paul Revere seat, riding around, shouting out to the city, warning those about what is to come. And there's, a time in history where that's important, and there's a time in history where it's just not important. But I think today is one of those times where we need Paul Revere's to step up, to saddle up, and to be able to sound the alarm on things that just aren't right.
And yeah, that's I can I identify with that as well, having sort of been Paul revering for such a long time. Darin, we're going to have to jump to our short break. Again, website TuttleVentures.com, and feel free to call in. Anyone listening, we'll be right back.
Here we go. TNT Radio News.
This is James O'Neill with a check of today's headlines. A professor of public health policy at Johns Hopkins University has told Congress that it was a no-brainer that COVID-19 originated from a Chinese laboratory the same day the director of the FBI made a far more cautious assertion to the same effect. Russian President Vladimir Putin said in an interview broadcast Sunday that Russia has no choice but to take into account NATO's nuclear capabilities, in remarks justifying Russia's recent suspension of its participation in the New START treaty.
Silence for thinking differently? Not here. Silence for asking questions? Not here. Silence for discussing the other side of the story? Not on TNT Radio. Join the conversation anytime. Search TNT Radio on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Getter, or Gab. Download the TNT Radio app for free from the App Store or Google Play. Today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
And we're back with Darin Tuttle of TuttleVentures.com and talking about the world of money and power, and being watchmen. And there's a lot to watch out against. There's a lot of insanity and tyranny and corruption and collapse going on. And so, what are some of the main things that you sort of follow?
Hrvoje, we talked about this, I think, a little bit before the show as well on Twitter and the messages. And what I think is important, right, as an investor, as a portfolio manager, someone that's been doing this for a career, well, we never really want to get too tied up in the topic du jour, right, and fear-mongering. But being able to identify the opposition in order to win is what I think is important. So rather than, focus on individual opinions on where investments are going, understanding the framework of how you look at a global investment portfolio and its impacts on it in today's world, I think is what's most important. Putting that into specific context here is when you have a globally diversified portfolio, and you want to allocate to something called emerging markets. This is, outside of a U.S.-based investment. This is going to those countries that have the potential for a lot of growth in the future. Well, back in, say, 2019, the lead emerging market index started to accumulate a percentage of investment in China, to where China was not only like a 10% allocation to an emerging markets framework in a globally diversified portfolio, but rather 20, 30, 40%. And so as this was increasing back in 2019, I started to do some of my homework and say, okay, what's the framework, the methodology that's going in behind China, and what were our relations at the time? And I think, you talked about China before, but talking about China today and some things that have happened in the past are important because it impacts a globally connected investment framework. The clearest example I can give is if you look at Huawei, right? So Huawei 5G networks, the world's largest provider of 5G networks, and basically the leader in world telecommunications. Well, if you go back to May of 2019, the Department of Commerce placed Huawei on an entity list, actually restricting U.S. companies from selling goods and technologies to the company. Well, why would they do that? If you fast forward and rewind a little bit before that, Huawei was actually providing servers and network supplies for the U.S. government, and they found listening devices. You can look it up. It's a Bloomberg article where Huawei, was essentially just a commercial extension of the Chinese Communist Party, placing listening devices and tracking devices within U.S. servers And for that reason, the Department of Commerce placed the world's largest 5G network provider on an entity list restricting goods and services for them. That was a really big deal, and there was a lot of money behind that. Since that time, the U.S. has put pressure on other countries to do the same, to ban Huawei, to convince them of being a part of this quote-unquote clean network initiative to increase security standards and to know where things are coming from. If you remember, like Canada was actually in some hot water. They had one of the CEOs of Huawei's daughter actually get arrested in Canada for some other related offense. But in theory, it was a tit for tat on this Huawei communications network that wasn't trusted with the U.S. within the U.S. government, and subsequently Canada has banned the telecommunications provider as well. When things like this happen, they have real consequences on an investment portfolio. And if you have an advisor that maybe just isn't attuned to things that are happening in the geopolitical landscape, they may miss those opportunities and also those risks for you.
Yeah, and this just reminds me. I mentioned this yesterday. This also reminds me of the Croatian Canadian investor Marin Katusa, who used to work for Casey Research, and then he started doing his own thing. I interviewed him about a decade ago while I Skyped him into my university class. Unfortunately, I didn't get a recording of it. But in his newsletter, which I read from time to time, he mentions there's things he'll invest in that he's not particularly for. Like he was talking about ESG and this carbon stuff, and I'm like, I myself couldn't really invest in that. But hey, you can make money. And when I was in Kazakhstan before COVID, my wife was going to open a Kazakh stock account, invest in Kazakh companies like Kazatomprom, which has the uranium monopoly, and eventually their stock went up 3 times at that, when we were there. But when COVID hit, I'm like, I'm not comfortable now having a stock account in Kazakhstan because in the future, this is just my perspective. I don't know if I'll be able to travel there in the future because the WHO wants to bring back vaccine passports, and then because for some things like that, you'll need. I was actually thinking of buying property there as well in Kazakhstan, and so if I can't travel there, that's going to cause issues. But for further thoughts from you regarding China, U.S. and other issues.
Yeah, I mean all of that. You're talking about the accounts. You're talking about whether or not it's safe to go into a country or not. A lot of people will say, you know what, I don't want to make those type of decisions. I'm just going to passively invest. But if you remember at the beginning of the show, I mentioned that emerging markets allocation was actually within a passive investment. So a passive investment chose to increase their China exposure from 2019 till now from 10% to above 30%. And so a lot of people think that if they are invested in passive investment products, that means that they're making the right investment decisions, and that's not always the case, right? And I believe that we're in a world now of kind of a bifurcation, and the bifurcation I mean is that regional powers and commodities and currencies and country governance is going to become even more important going forward. That's the geopolitical landscape that we're investing in today. I also believe on the flip side of that, and this is one of my Paul Revere warnings, is that there's another group of people that are looking to have a one world government. And on the back end of that one world government, from an investment landscape, you're looking at a global minimum corporate tax, a biosecurity state that can be tied to incentives, a global central bank digital currency with the SWIFT UPI and IMF SDR quotas, and the understanding the bifurcation of those and a global one world government as an ultimate goal it really tends to, in my opinion, shift the importance not to whatever is happening in the world wherever, but what's happening in your homes, what's happening in your local government, what's happening in your state, and then what's happening in your country, and how can you positively affect those things first?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot that you just mentioned, and it's funny. I was going to mention in the next my next news segment an article from 2 days ago from the Strait Council for a Union of Democracies. They're one of the key think tanks pushing for a world government, and their article says Apollo missions pushed forward a one planet ideology, but will this ever replace nationalism? So they are advocating, we need a world government, and we need to find a one world ideology that will basically brainwash everyone into accepting this idea. And a number of, I feel it's sort of inevitable, the trend. We're just headed straight into it. Some of my guests agree as well. And I guess the question I'd have for you then is that I think about in the near term, how do we then survive within such a system? And as you mentioned, global biosecurity, WHO is rolling out these vaccine passports. Every nation is rolling out CBDCs. Going into such a world, what do you think about going into such a system?
Yeah, I think the first one, Hrvoje, is just the fact that your spidey sense is going off when you're reading these different articles, right? So just being aware of their goal of a one world government, I think helps put things into reference as you read and absorb different things that are going on. From an investment standpoint, you want to start looking at a framework of where are your largest dependencies. So you mentioned commodities, right? And you had mentioned one commodity in particular that was a large producer. Well, the war in Ukraine, you're starting to find out more about these commodities that are particular focus in Russia. I think the one that you were talking was uranium, right? Mm-hmm. So the first is understanding that commodities are an important aspect in an economy, and that if there is this reshoring that is occurring, and taking away ties from global supply chains, that's going to be beneficial for your domestic producers of the commodity that you're consuming in that country. If it's a steel maker in the U.S. or chemical manufacturers in the U.S., that may have, an outsized impact for what you're using, as opposed to an investment with a chemicals manufacturer or a steel company globally. So that's number one. The second is identifying these currencies, right? So if you have a dependency on the U.S. dollar, then you should be aware of, where the U.S. dollar is headed and some of the potential impacts of what it would have for you and your investment portfolio. For example, inflation, right? Inflation is a back-end tax that if you aren't aware that, the cost of retirement is only going to be going up when inflation is going up, then that may incentivize you to look at your cash savings and actually start putting your money to work, because retirement is only going to get more expensive in the future.
Yeah, and you mentioned something that I've also been keeping an eye out is you mentioned, the global minimum corporate tax, but I also think they'll be going after individuals. The OECD is spearheading this, and they want basically like a global income tax and make it so you can't really hide anywhere. And I've got 3 passports, and it's interesting. As a Croatian, if in Croatia at the local police office, if I'm registered as living in Croatia, but then I leave somewhere abroad and make money, I still owe taxes to Croatia. But then if I unregister, which I am, I can live anywhere outside of Croatia. I don't have to pay taxes. as a U.S. citizen, you can live anywhere and you have to report taxes. So you've got all these minefields to navigate, but also loopholes. And I feel like eventually they're going to want to close up loopholes for all citizens and start, they're talking about green taxes, carbon taxes. And I feel like, and now I'm seeing this with payment processors, that people like me, podcasters, use every year. They're making it more stringent now for tax reporting and making it harder than to legally not pay taxes. So, any further thoughts on, this global government tightening the screws on taxes?
Yeah, I've been a long critic of a global minimum corporate tax in the past. So I've been on record, outlining the fact that a global minimum corporate tax sounds great in theory. However, the incentives are all misaligned, right? Because if you have a global minimum corporate tax, but it's going to those individual countries, then one country will want to tax you more than the other, right? It's also almost impossible to enforce globally, right? So any smart country outside of the G7 would immediately start to lower their corporate tax to reap the benefits of foreign direct investment, if that country is, under somewhat pressure from balance of payments or something along those lines. And so, I'm a doubter of the initiative in total. I see why they would want to do it, especially, as the rising debt globally becomes a little bit unsustainable for some sovereign nations. But at the same time, we have to understand that, what are taxes used for, right? And, that ability to tax needs to be accurately represented. Your specific instance, right, with the tax code is unique, right? The U.S. we tax on, it doesn't matter where that dollar comes from, the U.S. is going to want to tax it, right? As opposed to, say, a residence-based tax, where in Canada, you're only taxed if you're living in Canada. I think understanding the tax codes of the countries that you live in, or having, experts that know the tax treaties and tax codes of the countries that you live in is of vital importance, right? Because you don't know what you don't know. And you can suddenly get a big tax surprise if you're not following all the rules of a particular tax treaty or a tax code of a country that you're living in.
Yeah, and a lucky thing for Americans, you get up to a certain amount. You get an income exclusion, which is kind of cool. So we're going to have to jump to our break. Again, the website is TuttleVentures.com or newsletter.TuttleVentures.com. You can find Darin on Twitter at Darin, DARIN_T and the number 80. Feel free to dial in on our final segment. We're happy to chat. We'll be right back.
With his expert analysis and opinion, this is TNT Radio's Timothy Shea.
And just like that, natural immunity is no longer a conspiracy theory. Defying centuries of medical knowledge, the COVID-19 propaganda industry insisted that natural immunity did not apply to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Far-left Mother Jones said anti-vaxxers have a dangerous theory called natural immunity. Now it's going mainstream. CDC said getting a COVID-19 vaccination is a safer and more dependable way to build immunity to COVID-19 than getting sick with COVID-19. Mayo Clinic, USA Today, and many other propaganda outlets chimed in. Well, guess what? Not only is the public starting to realize that the vaccines are neither safe nor effective, even CDC is starting to admit that natural immunity is real. Congratulations to everyone who stood strong despite this hurricane of propaganda, lies, and deceit. You are the true heroes of this entire debacle. From MAGAInstitute.com, this is Timothy Shea for TNT Radio.
Challenging the consensus and debunking the narrative. This is Viewpoint.
While the mainstream media peddles fear, thousands of prominent scientists are speaking out despite a near blackout in the mainstream media. For example, Clintel was founded in 2019 by Emeritus Professor of Geophysics Gus Berghout and science journalist Marcel Kroc. This global network of 900 scientists and professionals make the point that CO2 is not a pollutant. It is essential to all life on Earth. Photosynthesis is a blessing. More CO2 is beneficial for nature, greening the Earth. Additional CO2 in the air has promoted growth in global plant biomass. It is also good for agriculture, increasing the yields of crops worldwide.
The digital ID will be the collar around our necks. Their power is only what we allow them to have. Don't comply at all costs. Lighting the fuse for freedom. TNT Radio.
We're on our final segment with Darin Tuttle of newsletter.tuttleventures.com, and something you mentioned in your notes about narratives, and you've listed some of the people I believe that you listen to, and it's funny. One of them, Michael Hilliard of Australia, of the Redline podcast. I was a guest on Redline a couple of years back, and he was a guest on my Geopolitics and Empire podcast. And it's funny, it just so happens, like this was before I even got you on. Tomorrow, he's going to be, in 24 hours, he's going to be my guest first hour on TNT. So pretty synchronistic. So, thoughts on the narrative machine?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great plug there. Michael is great. Talk to him. I think the way that he views the world and incorporates information is going to be valuable. So looking forward to that conversation going forward. What we talk about is great, but it's sometimes difficult to be able to measure the magnitude of the waves of sentiment and influence that we find in the quote-unquote narrative machine. And so what I've done, to help me analyze and measure these forces is to apply them into questions and then apply a probability associated with those and then track it over time. A really good example of this is the Good Judgment Open project with Philip Tetlock. And the wisdom of the crowds. And you can ask a question, any geopolitical question, like what are the chances, that the U.S. is going to blame the Wuhan lab for the outbreak of SARS-CoV-19, right? And maybe assign a probability of that, maybe 30% here, 3 years ago, but today, it's now looking at 100%. And so the magnitude of that change in sentiment, right, from applying it 30%, 3 years ago to 100% today, what were the impacts, or who were the voices that were speaking out to facilitate that change? Because I think what's important if you're applying, a geopolitical framework to an investment portfolio.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the China thing now being at 100%, and I'm fearing that where that could take us, to conflict, and you're already seeing some sorts of McCarthyism back in the States, where you can't talk about certain things, and I think that would affect, of course, investments, and so. And I think it's great, as you say, each of us should formulate these strategies and paradigms for analyzing the world, and it's all related. If you're going to invest, you need to know and anticipate a lot of these events, and other further thoughts that you have.
Yeah, and Hrvoje, I wrote back in October of 2022 about trade war with China, and I said, when a trade war with China breaks out, a passive investor actually doesn't choose a side, and so a passive global investor actually loses on both sides during a trade war because of the political instability, and war historically has depressed global trade. So, as a consequence, this decline in globalization leads to lower future expected returns for portfolios that solely rely on global synchronized growth happening year over year over year. And, for me, there's a lot of different voices that I hear, but at the end of the day, I want something that can be measurable, that has that can be tracked over time, and so Marko Papic is somebody that I follow pretty closely. He's a chief strategist with the Clock Tower Group with an investment focus called Geopolitical Alpha. He came from George Friedman, which was the chairman of Geopolitical Futures now, and Stratfor before, which was this large U.S. think tank. And Jacob Shapiro was actually another one that was associated with Stratfor before, and he's a chief strategist at Cognitive Invest. All three of those, Marco, George, and Jacob, have a pretty good geopolitical framework that can be quantified and measured over time to be able to see the magnitude and the impact of these shaping narratives that we see in the world, and to give us a better context of things going forward.
I do find it interesting because there are some investors that seem to be more mainstream, and they wouldn't mention some of the topics which you just mentioned, and I think that would be to their own detriment. Or I don't know if they secretly think about it or talk about it, but not publicly. But I think, a lot of the things that I've been talking about have come that I've predicted, or just, you could see the trends have happened, from 2020 with all the COVID stuff and the passports. I was here in Mexico in early 2020, or I think halfway through 2020, and they still hadn't, pressed the button and locked things down. And I'm like, oh yeah, they're going to do it, and they're going to bring in the vaccine passports, and they're going to do, and it all happened. And then again, if you think beyond the Overton window, outside the box, whether it's investing or just preserving your best interests, that's going to help you a lot. We got time is flying. We got about 4 minutes left to midnight or less. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, no, I would say that there's two other voices I would say that are in that Paul Revere vein that I think have pure intent to warn the public of things that they see that is not right. One of them is Ben Swan. So he's the founder of Sovereign Media, and the other is Jimmy Dore from the Jimmy Dore Show. Both of them have pretty good platforms to be able to speak freely and have tipped me off to things that I later come to fruition. So that's number one. Number two is, I would just say, in terms of investing, most people are just only invested in stocks or bonds. But when you have currencies or commodities become as important as they are today, that's when you really need to start to expand your investment framework. And investing in currencies or commodities is typically reserved for the largest institutions. And so, working with the trusted experts that have the skills and the expertise to be able to do that, I think puts you at an advantage in terms of diversification, as opposed to just a passive investor in a stocks and bonds portfolio.
What might be in the near term one of your biggest economic threats? Would it be something like in just this inflation that just keeps permanent inflation, hyperinflation, or off the top of your head or feeling, what's one of the things that we should maybe be thinking about most?
Oh, I wouldn't say threats. I would say opportunities, right? Because with every threat, there's an opportunity. I wrote on my newsletter back in December the 2023 Investing Playbook, and I mentioned in there how Mexico actually is going to be at the top of our list for investment going forward. We believe that the sovereign debt of an emerging country like Mexico is ultimately tied to its growth prospects. We really like the total tax revenue to GDP of Mexico, which is actually one of the lowest in the world at 16%. We think that Mexico has the ability and the capacity to grow in the future and to actually tax that growth going forward. We think that Mexico is, a big beneficiary of increased industrial production being onshored into the U.S. And so, for countries that are reshifting their supply chains, if they're moving something from China and they can't do it in the U.S., Mexico is in a much better position there. than some other countries, and their debt levels are pretty great. Debt hasn't really spiked for Mexico like it has in other countries, and the U.S. dollar to peso exchange rate is at the current level of around 19. So it's actually depreciated some. So there's a lot of upsides that we think there that
we're about to run out of. We're about to run out of time, Darin. I'd agree. I'm very bullish on Mexico. About 25 seconds left. Where's the best place to find your stuff online?
Yeah, you can visit TuttleVentures.com, TUTTLE Ventures.com, or you can subscribe to my Substack newsletter, TuttleVentures.com. You can find all my stuff there, and if we identify and understand the game, we can live financially free going forward.